Welcome to Crosspoint. An interactive program featuring ministers and leaders of the Christian community addressing the issues that are challenging the church today. Here's your host, Mark Taylor.
Just who is Babylon the Great? Who are the spiritual gods involved? Well, welcome to this edition of Crosspoint. I'm Mark Taylor, your host. My guest today is Tyler Gilreath. He's an avid Bible researcher, writer, speaker, and Tyler joins me today as we discuss the gates of the gods. Thank you for joining us on this edition of Crosspoint. Today with me, I've got Tyler Gilreath. And Tyler, it's an interesting name to your book here, Gate of the Gods. We've talked before, this is about Revelation, the Messiah, and the second coming of Babylon. I know a lot of people have heard in the past, when we talk a lot about prophecy and things happening, who is Mystery Babylon? Who is this Mystery Babylon? You say, right in the preference there of the book, you say, this book tracks the supernatural war in the book of Revelation by investigating the mysterious identity of Babylon the Great. And you say, I argue that it's not all about Rome. Well, there you go. You're getting, you're wading into it right off the bat. But tell us a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. Mark, it's good to be on the program today. This is an important topic for so many people, especially today with everything going on in the world. People are looking to read, study, understand the book of Revelation like never before. And as soon as the reader dives into the book of Revelation, they're confronted with this mysterious antagonist, this dark figure called Babylon the Great, or Mystery Babylon. And the book that I wrote, Gate of the Gods, looks to pull back the veil, to unmask who is this sinister and powerful entity in the book of Revelation. And that's one aspect of the book. It's one of the main aspects of the book, and I'm sure we'll talk about a lot of different lanes that the book discusses. But essentially, Babylon the Great historically has been identified as Rome. And we understand why. The early church lived under Roman rule. And I don't deny that Rome was a modern-day Babylon by any means. There's been hundreds of books written on Roman threads in the book of Revelation. My book simply doesn't investigate that. It doesn't deny the Roman proxy of the Roman existence, but it investigates the supernatural forces behind Babylon the Great. And that's really at the heart of what the book does, is it reveals that Babylon is an engine of chaos in the book of Revelation that is being driven by supernatural forces. And so Rome was a modern-day puppet pulled by the strings by marionettes of the fallen angels that go back to the Tower of Babel. And so that is one of the key takeaways of the book, is that Babylon the Great is inseparable from this Babel event, which I wrote extensively about in my first book, Gospel Over Gods, and I recap in my new book, Gate of the Gods. And essentially, the Tower of Babel event in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 8 and 9, was a retelling of the Babel event that happened in Genesis 10 and 11. And in the Genesis account, we're not given too many details, but in the Deuteronomy 32, 8 and 9 account, we are. And in that account, it says that when God divorced the nations after they built this temple structure to the sky, he allotted the nations to angels, or sons of God. Those entities became the small g gods that we read about in our Old Testaments. They led the nations into darkness. That was not God's intent. If your readers want to read Psalm chapter 82, that psalm is a scathing psalm against the angels that were given the nations at the Tower of Babel. And so those are the principalities, the powers that Paul discusses in the book of Ephesians and elsewhere in the Pauline epistles. Those angels are the driving force in the book of Revelation of cosmic evil. Those angels are Babylon the Great. So that kind of gives you an introduction of where the book heads.
I noticed, too, that, in the introduction of the book, you started off with the Old Testament and Revelation. And you've got here, I'm looking at where I guess the most talk about Revelation in the Old Testament was the book of Isaiah, but I was really surprised that the book of Psalms was that close to having stuff to do with Revelation, and the end times and stuff. How did you go about? I mean, this took a lot of studying to go through all of this.
It absolutely did. I've been working, in ministry for 15 years. I've avoided, like the plague, the book of Revelation as far as teaching it, because I didn't have, first off, before I wrote my first book, I was kind of lacking the supernatural worldview of the Bible. Once I started studying that for years and wrote the first book, I felt like I had a good foundation to move forward with doing an in-depth study of the book of Revelation. And once I started that, I really came across a revolutionary principle in the book that is the Old Testament is everywhere. It is the DNA of the book of Revelation. And so you're exactly right, Mark. I think on page 1 of my book, I start off by kind of tallying and tracking the number of Old Testament allusions in the book of Revelation, and it is quite extensive. Most Christians think the book of Hebrews has the most Old Testament references, but Hebrews is, no, not even close to what we see in the book of Revelation. I mean, you mentioned the Psalms, the Pentateuch, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, the minor prophets. I mean, there are just so many references. Now, I certainly didn't track all of them myself. I leaned on some scholarly work that others have put in over the years and kind of went back behind them and checked and, did my own due diligence. But essentially that was an overlooked area of study for hundreds of years. And it wasn't until several decades ago that people actually began investigating how many Old Testament verses or allusions are in the book of Revelation. I think it was like 1984 or something like that.
Aren't most Christians not even familiar with the Old Testament? I mean, they just don't like to read it.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's the elephant in the room, the glaring problem is that, it's nice, now that we know the Old Testament is so important, but if you're not familiar with your Old Testament, it's not going to help you. And so that's really one of the reasons why it's been overlooked. John's use of the Old Testament has been egregiously overlooked because we are just unfamiliar overall with our Old Testaments. So the book, it challenges folks to dive into their Old Testaments because I go throughout the Apocalypse and I have, sections and investigate these verses, and I pull out Old Testament verses from which John is drawing the material, and the Holy Spirit is leading John to write. And so I can't cover all the allusions, in one book. There would be volumes of that, but I cover many of them. And so readers of my book expect to read a lot of Old Testament in the first half of the book in particular, as it investigates how John is utilizing the Old Testament across the board. And it's extremely eye-opening, and it's also empowering, Mark, because it gives people a template, a way forward to understand what in the world is going on in this very mysterious book.
Now, in the first chapter, you talk about the battle of the churches. And you say the powers of darkness are not uninterested in tarnishing Christ's bride. They're relentless and obsessed with recapturing the heart of what the Messiah values most, his people. Then you say hell has an insatiable appetite for Jesus' followers, and it's evidenced by the speeches to the churches. So the church is the big deal, which is the followers of Christ. That's the biggest deal of all that he's got to deal with, and really the whole reason for Revelation, the fight that they have, and the talk about the churches.
That's exactly right. Yeah, the churches are, that's why Jesus died. He died for people. And when we come to the Lord, we are put in Christ, and we become a part of the ecclesia, the called out. And Satan and his demons and his angels, contemporaries, they are always looking to drag us back into the darkness. And what we find in the book of Revelation, in the early part of the book, are letters written and spoken really by Jesus to the churches. Mark, these are essentially investigations. Throughout the book of Revelation, Jesus is acting as an investigative judge. And he's saying, this is what I have found when I looked into your doings and your activity. And so the most shocking thing of all, Mark, is that what Jesus found in most of these 7 churches is idolatry. I talk about that in depth in the book. Again, you don't get that with clarity unless you are picking up what John is laying down, and what he's laying down is Old Testament allusions that has the context of idolatry, such as he mentions Balaam, how there were those of the Balaamites or the Nicolaitans in one of the churches. And Balaam was a pagan prophet who tried to lead God's people into idolatry. Another church, there's this mention of Jezebel. Jezebel was the same type figure, a dark sexual woman that tried to lead God's people astray. And so you have these Old Testament figures reappearing in the churches or among the churches, not as literal. Jezebel, wasn't resurrected and attended the church or anything like that, but you had these figures that resembled these Old Testament pagan figures such as Jezebel and Balaam.
Yeah.
And so it's shocking to think that the problem, one of the main problems, the main issue Jesus found with the church in the first century was that they were worshiping other gods. They were going back to paganism, or they were trying to somehow do both, basically worship the Messiah on Sundays and acquiesce to, the pagan deities of the day. And so that was a huge problem in the early church, and it's, like I said, quite shocking to actually go through the material and see it, and see the Old Testament linkages that are there in the text.
Page 50 of the book, you got a part here where, Jesus has appeared, John's having his vision. It says, Jesus then tells John, I'm the one who lives and was dead, and behold, I'm living forever. Having died and risen again on the third day, Jesus is the living God, like Yahweh is described in the Old Testament. And then you say, down below what Jesus says next is the pinnacle of this present reality. I hold the keys of death and Hades. This statement is loaded with many enriching and liberating thoughts, truths. At the heart of this statement is the underworld battle between Christ and, of course, death and hell, Hades. And the battle for the keys is kind of way you kind of got this here. So there is that battle because of what Christ did, and because he has the keys. That really, to me, infuriates Satan.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's amazing, Mark. I talk about this in my first book, but basically, when in the Gospels, when Jesus says, "All authority has been given unto me on heaven and on earth," that's pretty much exactly what Satan had previously said to Jesus when in the wilderness, when he was asking him to bow down. And he says, he has all this authority and I can give it over to you. And so there was something that occurred in between Jesus' ministry and his post-resurrection accounts. It is the underworld experience that Jesus had. It's quite amazing when you begin to think about all the things that occurred those 3 days when his disciples were distraught, broken, destroyed. Jesus was busy in the netherworld defeating these demonic underworld deities. It opens up more of the gospel and why the resurrection is so powerful. Previously for thousands of years, these netherworld entities had claim to souls that would pass from this life into the next. And they had authority. Satan is the Lord of the dead. And I talk about in my book some other dark figures, such as Maveth. Maveth was a demon who's mentioned in the Old Testament in the Hebrew, but you don't get that in the English, unfortunately, because it gets translated death. But nevertheless, he's personified. He's a being. And Israel repeatedly made a covenant with Maveth and got scolded for it by Yahweh in the Old Testament. And now in Revelation, Jesus, the Messiah, has suddenly overcome Maveth, or death and Hades. Death and Hades in particular are also, figures in the Greek stories, the Greek mythology. And someone's thinking, well, what in the world is Greek mythology doing in the Bible? Well, it's because echoes of these mythological beings or mythological gods, if you will, from pagan societies actually have nuggets of truth in them. These fallen angels and these demons and these giants were venerated as gods. And so what did Jesus do? Jesus went down to the underworld and he took the keys away from the two bad boys of the netherworld, and he said, you know what? You're staying here and I'm leaving. Give me the keys. I have all authority. When I leave this place, all authority will be given unto me on heaven and on earth. It's amazing. There's other passages we could talk about if we had more time where Jesus said, all knees will bow that are on the earth and under the earth. I don't know if you've ever caught that in some of the scriptures, but these are literal entities that reside under the earth, and that was the concept that the ancients had, that the underworld was under the world. And so, again, Jesus taking their keys, stripping them of their authority, of their power, it just elevates Jesus to his proper place, and that is, again, the power of the resurrection.
All right, well, folks, interesting conversation. Stay with us. We'll be back right after this.
Harper's Kennel of Stella, Missouri is proud to be sponsoring this portion of broadcasting on KNEO. Owned by Judy and Danny Harper, Harper's Kennel of Stella, Missouri specializes in French Bulldogs. For more information, the phone number is 417-628-3083.
This is Mark Taylor. If you miss a broadcast of Crosspoint, you can always go to our website at www.kneo.org and click on the programs page. There you can access the current Crosspoint program as well as the last 4 programs that have been aired. Never miss another Crosspoint program again. Go to www.kneo.org today. Welcome back to Crosspoint. I'm Mark Taylor. My guest today with me is Tyler Gilreath. And Tyler, you've talked about this book, Gate of the Gods. We'll talk about it today, but you've done other books too. Tell people how they can find out more about this book and others.
Well, the books are on Amazon. You can type in my name, Tyler Gilreath, and you'll see my 2 books come up, and I would certainly recommend your readers check out both of those. You can probably also find my new book on Skywatch TV bookstore. They are the publisher, and so they can get those copies in those places. I'm sure it's also online in a lot of other places. Hopefully your listeners will check them out.
Chapter 5 of the book is Jesus in Armageddon. You've got the scripture there from Revelation 19:11, and I saw heaven open and behold a white horse, and the one seated on it was called Faithful and True, and with justice he judges and makes war. And then you talk about down here, that through the Messiah's victory is certain, though the Messiah's victory is certain, the nation's gods have yet to relinquish the fight. In this chapter, you talk about explores the battle of Armageddon and how Revelation frames with this conflict and consistent with Old Testament imagery. Now, Tyler, you hear the story of Armageddon. We've heard that forever, the big battle.
Oh, yeah.
But then we hear about the catching away, where the saints are just going to disappear, and then some of us is coming back. We're coming back. So is there kind of 2 exit systems here with this all happening?
One thing, I don't really get into the sequence of events as far as a linear view in the book, but I'll let others hash that out. But the focus of the Armageddon section of the book, Mark, is, like you said, it's been talked about for eons. And in Revelation, there are actually 3 Armageddon passages. Doesn't mean there are 3 different Armageddons. It just means it gets discussed 3 times. And I talk about why that's important in the book. But one of the main takeaways, Mark, is that Armageddon was talked about previously before Revelation was ever written. When we found the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1947, we found one scroll called the War Scroll. again, this is a Jewish document that was written most likely by the Essenes, but they describe Armageddon as being a 7-round match between the sons of light and the dark ones or the evil ones. Where did they get that idea? Well, they got it from Ezekiel 38:39. And so now we're really getting to the root of Armageddon. Armageddon, again, is not a New Testament concept, not even a Dead Sea Scroll concept. It's an Old Testament concept, Ezekiel 38:39. And so I talk about why that's important in the book and look at all of the similarities between the two accounts. In other words, there are common elements between Ezekiel 38:39 and the Revelation accounts of Armageddon. And so you have this, Gog and Magog. You have these birds of prey, and again, a lot of common elements between the two. And I talk about why that's important. But one of the main differences, Mark, between what we find in Revelation and what we find in the Dead Sea Scrolls and Old Testament material, the Old Testament and the Dead Sea Scroll material kind of mention the number 7. I believe the Ezekiel 38:39 talk about 7 years, and the Dead Sea Scroll material talks about 7 rounds. And on the 7th round, the Messiah gives the knockout blow to the powers of darkness. But in the book of Revelation, it seems to be a little bit different. It seems to be over before it really starts. In other words, darkness doesn't really stand a chance. There's not really a back and forth tussle. And so in Armageddon and Revelation, the way it gets described, it's just like it kind of goes without a bang, goes out without a bang. We're not saying it's not going to be supernatural. We're not saying it's not going to be powerful or any of those things. It's just interesting, and I think the reason Revelation describes it in those terms is because it wants to elevate the power of the Messiah versus the powers of darkness. And so however it shakes out, Mark, whether it's 7 years, 7 rounds, or whatever, the point is consistently throughout all the decades and millennials, if you will, of time, the light wins. Yeah. And that's the point.
Yeah.
The light wins. And so it gives more context for folks who approach the pages of Revelation when they understand this is a very ancient conversation that precedes the book of Revelation. And when we look at all the data, when we look at all the material, we get a better and a clearer picture of the players that will be involved in Armageddon and who will win and why they will win.
Chapter 7 of the book is entitled The War in the Stars. Now over here on page 119, you talk about the gods of Babylon. So how does the gods of Babylon affect the spiritual atmosphere of today?
Oh, the gods of Babylon are the entities that are causing chaos that we see on our television. I mean, there's wars, rumors of wars. We see, the nation of Israel is, pretty much surrounded by enemies. And, there's being threats and bombs dropped and nukes, maybe not nuclear weapons at this point, but they're there, and the threat of war is always there. And so the entities that Paul says we wrestle with, those, again, they're influencing nations to do crazy things, harmful things, evil things. They're influencing their leaders. They're influencing their populace. And so, again, if folks don't think we're in a war, I don't really know what planet they're living on, because, the war is all around us. And it's not just spiritual. It manifests in physical ways that's very out in the open. And so the gods of Babylon, again, they're the engine of chaos around the world. And Revelation describes those beings and their activity and how they will meet their end. So that's a very important section in the book, and I'm glad you brought it up. The War in the Stars is a very important chapter for folks who pick up a copy. It investigates the identities of the four horsemen, who are very mysterious figures, and they actually are four Babylonian demonic gods. The book explains why that's the case.
Yeah, some of the, mind pictures you get as you read the book of Revelation, you got this, well, what does that look like? How does that look? And that. I would imagine some of this stuff is a pretty horde-looking thing that we're seeing, and I can only unbelievable what John was thinking in that day and time, because he didn't have the insight in what we're seeing today, but yet, so it made very little sense to him sometimes of what he was talking about, but he knew God was telling him to put this in, and of course, thankfully we have it in the Bible that's been here for us for years to be able to follow along with. And chapter 9 of the book, you talk about in Revelation 13:1, you said, "Then I stood on the sand of the sea. I saw the beast coming out of the sea, having 10 horns, 7 heads. And of his horns were 10 crowns, and on his heads blasphemous names." And you say in this chapter we're going to discover the 2 beasts in Revelation 13 that are a blend of beasts cited in Daniel chapter 7. Tell us about that.
So now we're getting to, again, a very important aspect of the book, which is not only is the Old Testament a part of Revelation, but also Babylonian imagery is a part of the book of Revelation. Essentially, in Babylon, their most prized possessions were their ancient texts, the religious texts. And those texts and stories are much older than actually our Bible. And so when we begin to think about when Moses wrote the Bible, or John wrote Revelation or whatever, when Moses wrote Genesis, there was already well-established creation stories that were in existence. And one of those creation stories was the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish describes various beasts. It describes a sea dragon named Tiamat, who gets defeated by the high god of Babylon, Marduk. And after Marduk defeats the sea dragon in the sea and slays chaos, then Marduk is claimed king of the gods at Babylon. Marduk, by the way, is one of the figures I mentioned and alluded to a minute ago, one of the 4 horsemen that rides on the white horse. But nevertheless, part of this discussion of understanding Revelation is seeing Babylonian threads, because the whole point of the book, Mark, is to dismantle Babylon. And so if we're going to disarm and dismantle Babylon, we're not only going to literally defeat their demons, but we're going to also defeat their stories. And so John uses elements from Babylonian stories, such as the beasts and things like that, to disarm them, defeat them. And so, again, without an ancient repository of knowledge, or at least a general familiarity of some of these Babylonian stories, which the first century had and we simply, for the large part, have missed, we're going to be kind of in the dark on why certain of these images get brought up, such as the sea beasts of Revelation. We're missing the context and the framework to understand kind of what's going on. It may be subtle, but it's there. And so I familiarize the reader with that ancient story, the Enuma Elish, and how the Bible actually interacts with that story in the book of Genesis and the book of Revelation. In the second verse of the Bible, Mark, after God creates the heavens and the earth, the Bible depicts God as defeating or arresting the chaotic waters in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2. Now, that seems like a very strange thing to a modern person, but it goes back to an ancient conversation, which is, if you want to be God of gods, you have to defeat the chaotic waters, the sea beast that is there. And so the second verse of the Bible, God plugs himself into that discussion as defeating chaos. In the book of Revelation, do you know what happens, Mark, after Jesus, after all evil is put down? The Bible says that the sea is no more. The sea is no more in the new heavens and new earth. Well, why is that? Because the sea is associated with evil and chaos in that ancient conversation that really started in ancient Babylon. And so it is not Marduk, the high god of Babylon, who defeats chaos. It is the Messiah in the book of Revelation who will finally put down chaos and slay the dragon, if you will, and bring peace to all humanity.
Now, again, Tyler, tell people how they can find out more about your book, Gate of the Gods.
If people want to check out the book, I would just point people to Amazon. That is the most accessible platform for most people. Just type in the name or type my name in the search engine there, search bar, and you'll see it. You can also pick up a copy of my first book, Gospel Over God. I pray that it really blesses the reader to understand more of the book of Revelation.
All right. Well, folks, stay with us. We got more right after this.
Are you a Christian who likes to read? If not, there's a whole world of Christian publishing out there that you're missing out on. I invite you to check out the Author's Corner podcast, where I talk to the latest Christian authors each week about their new book releases and what's coming next. So if you're ready to jumpstart your spiritual growth with the newest books and the authors who write them, check out the Author's Corner podcast with me, Roberta Foster.
Sharing your faith can be as easy as sharing your favorite radio station.
There's no greater way to share the gospel, to reach as many people as possible than through Christian radio.
Tell your friends where they can experience hope.
It's always pointed to Christ.
91.7 The Word.
You're listening to Crosspoint. I'm Mark Taylor, your host. My guest today with me is Tyler Gilreath. And Tyler, looking at the book here, on page 192 is where I'm at right now. And it says, it is no secret that the number 7 is a fundamental throughout Revelation. Why is 7 such an important number for us to pay attention to when we see it?
Well, it goes back to, again, a topic that is overlooked, and it's called numerology. Modern people don't usually associate numbers with certain things, although we do sometimes. But 7 has always kind of been, throughout the ages, kind of been a number of completeness or a number of perfection, going back to even creation itself. God, splicing our week into 7 days. And so it's a part of the framework that's in the book of Revelation. There's a lot of 7s in there, a lot of, 7 churches, 7 angels, and 7 stars, and all these elements that are kind of consistent. The number 12 is also important, but the number 7 is certainly a big one. And I talk about, there's 7 angels in the book of Revelation, and actually give the identities, likely identities of those angels, and how there were 7 evil angels that were, named in Old Testament times, and in Babylon even had 7 pre-flood angels that were, evil, and how in Revelation you have 7 powerful good angels. And so there's a balance of kind of 7 angels on either side of the war. But anyways, the number 7 is certainly important. And I don't know if I answered your question completely, but I certainly fleshed that out pretty well in the book.
Back to this Babylon. It's always been kind of a supernatural place, and I believe that's what we're talking about, is a supernatural Babylon. You've heard a lot of people say, well, Babylon is going to be rebuilt. Then others say, no, Babylon is something different than that. Some people even talk about the mysterious Babylon being like New York City, or even some of the United States, some of the stuff we see happening and how those things connect. What are you actually trying to kind of get our attention to here when we talk about Babylon as a supernatural Babylon?
Babylon is an idea that is driven by real supernatural beings. It doesn't rely on a certain zip code. It can manifest in certain zip codes, but again, it has lived and existed for over 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years now. That is, the entities of Babylon. That's really what we're talking about. They have manifested themselves throughout the generations and have driven, again, world leaders, normal people, to do chaotic things and really muck up God's perfect creation. And so, we're not limiting Babylon to a city or a state or even a country. Babylon really has no limits. And so I think that's an important takeaway to understand, is that though it may manifest locally, it doesn't have to. It can, be in multiple places at one time because we're dealing with supernatural entities. And again, if your readers are not familiar with the Tower of Babel event, that is where Babylon began. That is, you can trace historically from the Tower of Babel to Babylon and how that came to be. But it's the beings that were allotted to the nations at the Tower of Babel event that have went on to be God's rivals, if you will, throughout the generations. And those are the entities, the devil's angels that Jesus spoke of. Those are the entities that we are at war with, and those are the entities that are manifesting as Babylon the Great still in 2024.
So this Babylonian framework, kind of, so Jesus is at war with the powers of darkness, which is basically the powers that come out of this. Is that what you're saying? Okay.
Exactly, yeah. Jesus is at war with the fallen angels that go back to the Tower of Babel event.
Okay.
Correct.
All right. So page 207, it say, Paul concludes in his letter to the church at Ephesus by admonishing them to be strong in the Lord, putting on the armor of God, which is found in Ephesians. Paul's words demonstrate that every soldier, even inexperienced ones, can stand strong against temptation. But without the armor of God, we're toast. So these fallen gods, this enemy we fight from, through the centuries, it's always the armor of God that's going to defeat them as far as it comes to the individual and stuff. I mean, we know that we've got angels fighting with angels, but for us, it's our armor with God that we need.
Exactly right, yeah. We don't need to go looking to fight an angel in a dark alley.
Yeah.
They're all around us. They can manifest, certainly, but Paul has told us that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal. We're given basically spiritual weaponry and spiritual defensive armor to repel the powers of darkness, and also to take the fight to them with the gospel. And so the best way you can defeat a demon is to not shout in the air and scold it. Again, I'm not saying you can't do that, but the best way to fight is to share the gospel, because when you share the gospel with someone, you are taking away someone that is imprisoned, spiritually imprisoned by these powers of darkness. And so that's how we that's at the core of how we fight Babylon, fight the powers of darkness, is by sharing Jesus and bringing others out of that darkness into the light of the Lord.
So are you trying to kind of stir people's spiritual senses? I mean, we actually are living in very prophetic times, I guess, and everything to me in the future is kind of a prophetic happening now, because we're seeing really major things that really indicate that we're at the end of this time period very closely now, and things are going to change, or could change overnight. Like you said, there's wars out there and going on, nothing that we haven't really seen, but the nuclear portion, all it takes is something to overwhelm Israel right now, and they may have no choice but to fire nuclear to just, actually obliterate them, to get them away from them, if they came after them. So we are sitting on the cusp of all this stuff happening, and these powers in the heavenlies, they are really, really bearing down, controlling these countries like Iran and the Hamas and those groups like that. All those. This is, you're kind of saying then these gods of Babylon are the ones that are fighting this, like what's even going on in the Middle East right now.
Exactly. Yeah. One thing that I know, Mark, from having studied the supernatural for years, is that when there is war on earth, there is war in the heavens. The chaos we're witnessing on our television is a mirror image of the chaos that is going on in the unseen realm, the unseen world. They are certainly driving the chaos that we see all around us. And so you're right. I mean, the threat of nuclear weapons is a scary, terrifying thought that is an unbelievable power that can bring down so many people at one time. But that's certainly what the powers of darkness would love, is an all-out nuclear war, no doubt.
Yeah. Now, last part of the book here, it's called More from the Author. And it says the Bible's fascinating and is no way fiction. Although we didn't walk in the holy mountains with Elijah or watch Jesus bleed, we believe what John 20:29 says. But let me ask you this question, you say. Have you ever felt like something in the Bible was missing, primarily a common thread that ties the entire narrative together from Genesis to Revelation? You said you did, and you said this missing link was the war of the unseen realm. And you said, I write all about this in this book. You're trying to tie this stuff together.
I'm trying to tie it together, and the book that I allude to at the end on page 211 is my first book, Gospel Over Gods.
Right.
And that book is a chronological study of the supernatural war between God and the fallen angels, all the way through the Bible, up until about the book of Revelation. My new book covers Revelation. But if people want to go on a fascinating journey through the Bible like they've never been on before, then my first book is the ticket. It will take you through and start in Genesis, start in the garden. It will take you through all three divine rebellions. You will see and learn so much about antiquity, the context of the Old Testament, the context of the New Testament, as it relates to the supernatural war. And so I would, again, encourage anyone listening to definitely check out that book if you want to learn more about the supernatural war of the Bible.
Before we go here, people out there for years, they've read the Bible, and there's been pastors and different ones that's read Revelation. They don't want to teach on it much. But, you hear about fierce dragon, seven-headed beast, these four horsemen of the apocalypse and all that. You think it's so hard for some people to try to understand is why they don't try to understand it?
I think a lot of people, it's kind of like, if you're not used to exercising or eating right, it's just hard to start. It's easier if other people are doing it with you. And so we're living in times where people are wanting to start really studying this very prophetic, apocalyptic book. And we need leaders and teachers and preachers to teach on it more than ever. But people do avoid it. And like I said, I avoided it for a long time, and that was certainly a mistake. But recovering the supernatural worldview of the Bible gives you a chance to really understand what is happening in the text. So, again, that's why it's so important, Mark, for people to recover the supernatural worldview of the Bible, to know that we are in a supernatural war, to be familiar with their Old Testaments like we talked about. That's important too. But just to start, and my books are certainly not the only books out there, but if you're looking to really get a good handle on the things that you desperately want to know about the supernatural that your church isn't talking about, get these books, because these books will, again, probably give you more information than you were looking for, but you'll come away with a fascination and appreciation for the lengths to which Yahweh the Lord has went to save your soul, to defeat the enemies, the powers of darkness. And when you understand the history of the battle, you'll appreciate the realness of the battle that is right in front of you. So, again, I pray it blesses people who check it out. All
right, and tell people again how they can check it out and find out more about Gate of the Gods and the other book as well.
If you want to pick up a copy of Gate of the Gods or Gospel Over Gods, you can go certainly to Amazon and check them out there. My new book, Gate of the Gods, is also available at the Skywatch TV bookstore.
All right. Well, Tyler, thanks so much for being with us here on Crosspoint.
Mark, it's been an honor to be your guest today. Thank you.
Folks, great interview we had today with Tyler. We get off a little deep in some of this stuff, but the Bible is somewhat, this book I have in my other hand here that we were talking a lot that, is the one that's the mirror of this Gate of the Gods that we were talking about, this Holy Bible. It's a mysterious book, but it is the truth. And folks, you need to know it. You need to know the Bible because it is the Word of God. It leads you to a right understanding of life. It's God's inspired words are going to never be outdated, and it will tell you how to live your life right, accurately each and every day. The Bible contains the most important words you're ever going to read and certainly ever follow. Be sure to join us again next time as we again discuss issues that are affecting the church. Have a great week and allow God to use you for His purposes so that greater things can be done. Make your life count in God's plans for eternity. I'm Mark Taylor.
Crosspoint is a program produced in Studio 101 at KNEO Radio. Not all of the views on Crosspoint reflect those of the management or staff of KNEO. You may contact the Crosspoint program at 10827 Highway 86 East, Neosho, Missouri 64850, or by email crosspoint@kneo.org. You can hear Crosspoint 4 times a week: Saturday morning at 1, Saturday afternoon at 2, Saturday evening at 9, and Sunday evening at 7. You can also listen anytime online at kneo.org.
Never miss your favorite show again. For more than 30 years, KNEO has been bringing you great Bible teachers on a local and national level. And now, we've made it easier than ever to hear from these great men and women of God. KNEO's entire lineup is now available to listen anytime, anywhere, through our website. Go to kneo.org/podcast to see all the options. You can search for programs alphabetically, or you can select individual categories like culture, kids, leadership, or music. We even have a category just for locally produced programs, so you can hear from pastors and spiritual leaders located right here in the 4-state area. And all these resources are absolutely free. KNEO's mission is to get God's Word in front of you, and this is one of the ways we do it. Give it a try today. Go to kneo.org and click on the podcast tab to get started.